Welcome to the Shield Your Business from Chaos podcast, where there's no building, no people, no third-party suppliers, and no systems all combined to create Chaos the Dragon, which is battled by King Phoenix and his shield.
Hi, welcome to the KISSBCP BCP podcast. I'm Roswitha Firth, and today's guest is John Ames. Very grateful to have John here. You have decades of experience, 40 plus years, which gives you definite street cred. And I know you keep up with all of the current thinking, some of which we like and some of which we probably want to reevaluate. So we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the things that can go wrong in the planning process. And I think the theme for today is stick to the script. So before we get started, I want to say a little bit about Kingsbridge. Kingsbridge has been in business for 40 odd years, I think since 1983, co-founded by Skip Williams. They provide both software as a service and consulting services to business continuity clients, large and small. John, I know you've worked in all industries, and that a lot of your recent experience in the last 10 or 15 years or so has been in the financial sector. Is there a particular experience or anything about that sector that you want to just briefly comment on, or maybe talk about why you do or don't love those experiences?
Actually, I think the financial sector is, well, as you mentioned, I worked in many, all right? And the financial sector is pretty much driven by regulatory oversight. So you have an audience that basically says, we have to do this. They may not know how to go about it, but they all have it. And with the FDIC and their regulations that they periodically update every 10 years, whether they need to or not, they have some guidelines that are provided to them that they must stick to.
It's a great point. In a way that makes it easier to get funding for business continuity, because it's not a want to, it's a have to. But sometimes I think that can devolve into checking the boxes in certain ways rather than thinking about true resilience.
I think that's the biggest obstacle. Even though they're required to do so, it does become an exercise in checking the boxes. And so when you introduce them to the concept and professional best practices and the processes, how they have to go about it, it kind of, a light bulb goes on. And they go, oh yeah, we just can't check the boxes. There's some things we particularly have to do. And I think that really hit home way back when Katrina hit, which is when it pretty much hit the financial sector. I should say most of the financial sector. The credit unions, for example. The banks have been doing it for many, many years. And as I mentioned in one of our previous conversations, I wrote my first plan back in 1975, okay? Professional best practices have really not changed since 1975. The process is still the same. And so convincing everyone to stick with professional best practices and matching those to the FFIEC guidelines, like I said, a light bulb comes on, and then it becomes their mission is somewhat changed.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned that the sort of best practices have stayed the same, because I think that that's something that some of our audience will definitely nod their head at this point in the conversation, and others might scratch their head a little bit, because so much has changed in our field that it might appear that we talk of operational resilience now, and we talk less about disaster recovery, and terms and meanings change, and we do have a lot of lingo. But I think to the point that you were making, and correct me if I'm leaving something out, but from when we first talked about this topic, the idea is that, when you go to build your program or your plan, there's certain key phases that we go through, including, for example, the business impact analysis and your threat risk assessment, et cetera. And that's the meat of what you're talking about. That really hasn't changed, nor the concept of sort of what we consider as best practices. If anything, has gotten more mature, but it certainly hasn't lessened.
Right. Yeah, I think the biggest change in our industry since over the last 48 years is we try to rename it every other year. You know, it was called disaster recovery when I first started. Okay. And now disaster recovery has a specific component, and that's technology, right? So, yeah, and I think as we talk, there are steps. And I think in our previous conversation, it's imperative that individuals that are starting or starting over or revisiting their plan, there are certain steps that have to take place in a certain order. I think I mentioned, and again, just to touch on, this is not just the financial sector. This process, these best practices carry over across sectors. In other words, these steps, if you want to call them steps, this is the process. This is the steps you must take in order to have a viable business continuity plan or business continuity management plan in today's world. And so, you know, just to touch on those steps briefly, I think everybody feel like I'm preaching to the choir half the time, but sometimes I have to poke the choir directors periodically. But it starts with, and I think you mentioned it, it starts with the budget. It starts with the budget, or it starts with management's commitment to the process. Okay, and then it's endorsed by management. There's a sponsor within the management structure. There's someone specifically assigned in the organization to deal with it, the business continuity coordinator, if you will. Then we get into the risk component. Then we get into the BIA, the business impact analysis. And then you put your solution together, you know, be that technology or be that from a business continuity perspective. And once that's all done, then you can start writing your plans because you know what's going to happen to you. You know where you're going to go if it does happen. Now write the plans. Or now, and Skip and I talk about this often, you know, now it's time to start plugging in the answers to make sure that you have this viable business continuity plan. But it doesn't stop there. You continue on after the plan is written, as again, you and I discussed, you know, you get into the training and awareness component. Everybody in the organization must know that we have a plan. Then you get into the testing piece. That is a big piece today. You have a plan, it's in a binder, or it's online real time, but you still have to test it to make sure the pieces and the parts you've got in place would indeed work if something hit the fan, right? And then there's plan maintenance. And this is, as we talked earlier, something that people, they think they've got it written and they're good with it, but you've got to maintain that thing. I can't tell you how many times over the years I've had to go in and dust off somebody's plan and find out that, you know, these people aren't here anymore. We don't do this anymore, you know, that kind of thing. And I think lastly, and this is, I think, relatively new to the industry. It's written into the FDIC component, but have somebody look at your plan, okay? The plan says, have your internal audit group look at it. Well, most internal audit groups can't spell business continuity planning, right? So they don't know what it is. So they don't know whether they have a viable plan or not. So having a third party or having a peer group look at it, that seems to be the theme now in some of the credit unions, where they're all getting together and revisiting everyone's business continuity plan and fixing it if need be. But that is the process. And then starting that process over next year, making sure you've got that management commitment, make sure that budget component is still there, all the way down the list again, revisit risk, revisit your BIA, and keep going. And that's, you know, that's my frustration in today's world, is they get it written, but they don't start over. It's not starting over, it's simply revisiting the process from beginning to end. So, you know, that's my world today, and that's what it should look like, truly, in my world. But I'm an old timer. I'm a frustrated business continuity planner from way back then.
So I'm going to pull the curtain back a little bit
Okay.
for our audience, because we had this conversation. Everybody I have as a guest on the podcast knows this, but I haven't particularly shared this with the audience. When I start the process of speaking with a potential guest, I have a short phone call, and the purpose of that is to find out whether this potential guest has a passion or a pet peeve within the field of business continuity,
Okay.
because those make for the most interesting conversations. You have a huge wealth of experience, and I think it's really telling that your passion is equally your pet peeve about how our industry so often can get it wrong, in that we finish the project and forget that it is a cycle. And the second piece of that is we don't stick to the script when we have an event. We might follow the steps for activation, and then at some point kind of abandon the process of what we're supposed to do, and everybody just kind of goes and does what they think they're supposed to do. Or we might not even follow the exact steps of the activation process, and not all the stakeholders get notified. And I really enjoyed our initial conversation, because it was so telling to me that this is something that you have encountered over and over and over again in your experience. It doesn't matter the sector, it doesn't matter the company size. This is a common theme. And I certainly am, echo your sentiments, but I was really glad that you brought this to the table as a potential topic, because I think it makes for something that we can individually kind of hammer on with our clients or our bosses. But as an industry, we have to tackle it and do a better job of educating, because otherwise people are still not going to stick to the script when there is an event, or they're not going to stick to the script all the way through the process, and something is going to get missed.
Yep, that's true. I mean, I could tell you a number of nightmarish stories about events that actually occurred.
Please do.
And when we went back and revisited did the after action report, we went, oh, there is a plan. Oh, we should have done this, that, or the other thing. And everything from a building fire to a situation and we had I could tell you a story. It's out of the financial sector back in the East Coast many years ago, where the fire department decided that they needed to put a fire hose to a communications cabinet because there was a little smoke coming out of the wall. Well, literally that shut that organization down. That there was a process that they pick up the phone, they call the vendor that was providing their offsite storage at the time, and they transport it to the old hot site environment. Well, that didn't quite happen. The manager went to the vault, grabbed the tapes, and took off down the road. And he was such a nervous wreck, he almost caused a wreck. And so when we revisited that, we went, it would have been a lot cleaner. The media would have got there a lot faster. You could have started your recovery process several hours ahead of by the time you got there. And so that's just one example. And I can tell you, every time we revisit an event, like I said, like you say, who communicated what? Who got in front of the press? That's a good one. Who got in front of the press? Well, it wasn't the person that was in charge of communicating with the press in terms of the plan, because they knew what to say. But the others, whoever they stuck the mic in front of, and my joke with my clients is the media is there before the event actually happens. So you better be prepared for it, So, but so so stick to the plan. There is a plan. And oftentimes revisions are made after the event, because they're not all perfect. Pandemic really played that out. Pandemic gave people to revisit their plan in a very slow manner, slow fashion. And it was amazing. To no surprise to a lot of us is, the BIA, everybody has a vision in their own mind when it comes to the BIA and how important they are. But as pandemic played out, the BIA got revised. And as a result, it truly impacted what the DR or IT component looked like would have looked like at time of real event. So a lot of things that were deemed critical, no, not so much. So that took the pressure off of IT in terms of at time of a major business disruption, that they didn't need to restore X number of applications because they were more in the 7 to 10 day time frame or 3 to 5 day time frame.
Yeah.
But they weren't day of the event kind of thing.
That's actually a really good point. Something that just occurred to me, and I'm sure other people have thought this, and perhaps you have as well, but it just came to my mind, is that the business impact analysis is supposed to be sort of the be all end all of your setting your priorities. I mean, money comes into it, obviously, but in terms of criticality, that's your source document. But the pandemic, as you said, proved that that wasn't necessarily the case. Now, I'm not suggesting that we write different BIAs for different types of events. Lord help us, that's definitely not what we need. However, it's a good lens to look at your BIA through, if you haven't already done so, is that, I mean, you had companies who literally quit making X and started making Y because of the pandemic. Specifically masks and respirators and other things like that, but also, the pivoting to online marketplace that happened within so many companies as well changed a ton of their priorities very, very quickly. And there were certain things that they probably had in their business impact analysis that were important to their profit margin that suddenly became irrelevant or minor because of the pandemic. So I'm not suggesting that we create another type of BIA. However, I do think that if you haven't already done so, it's worth it to look at that business impact analysis from the lens of the pandemic, or try to think of other types of events that might impact what you would bring up, what could change. Now that we have this experience of the pandemic to see like some of these shifts were truly, truly major and happened in a very short amount of time. So practitioners might take this as a learning opportunity if that's something that they haven't already done yet.
I think one of the biggest things was allocation of resources. When suddenly said everybody's working from home, and then they started looking at the BIA and say, well, I don't really need that. Well, someone who had not really given a lot of thought to their BIA suddenly realized that they needed to elevate particular functions they were performing, but they didn't have the resources to work from home to get that done. So, which only created more of a dilemma at time of when the pandemic first hit and they were shutting everything down. How do you get the resources? Because you just don't take the equipment, drop it on the porch, ring the doorbell, and say, here it is. There's a little bit more to it than that. So, so pandemic was a learning process. But and again, I always approach my planning from the worst case scenario. You talk about writing a BIA for every event. Well, now my methodology has always been take the worst thing that can happen to you and write your plan. Look at your BIA from that perspective and write your plan around that. Okay. I think I told this story many times where someone has decided from an IT perspective what is important to the organization. I have one organization that spent over $1.5 million putting a solution in place because they thought that was the most important application in the organization and the technology that supported it, and put it all together. And we did a formal BIA and found out that that wasn't even on anybody's list. It was just who yelled the loudest when the system went down on an ongoing basis. So that's why you stick to the process and you do the BIA. And I think another pet peeve, and I was going to mention this earlier, making sure that BIA is approved by everyone inside the organization. It's not just approved by the planners. Yeah, we got all the information we need. Let's go. Let's run with it. It's finding out from the very top down if everyone agrees with, here's what we're going to put together at time of event should the stuff hit the fan. And oftentimes you'll be surprised how many times senior management will change that, because a lot of what senior management, their knowledge base is a little different than the planner's knowledge base.
Right.
And so things would change and ultimately affect the budget. Big time.
Very, very, very much so. I think it's also interesting that there are assumptions going in, even at the senior management level, and that guides some of the process. And then when all the data is rolled back up again and proposed solutions presented, that, you know, in the span of the 3 to 6 months or 2 years, however long it took to get through that process, there's been business changes in some cases, or, you know, priority changes, whatever it might be, and the direction from senior management shifts after all the work has been done, which can really be a challenge and add kind of a mini phase onto that process, because you now have to say, oh, wait a minute. So we had these things in this order, and now all of a sudden this stuff has flip-flopped. So we have to go back and revisit certain portions of the data that we already gathered and make sure that we're addressing this new guidance from senior management. I've seen that happen over and over again, which is a challenge when you think of it as a project and not a process.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I said earlier, you know, as part of the process, you revisit your BIA, your business impact analysis, on an annual basis. You don't need to do the formal process. In fact, I basically proposed, or the way I work with my clients is we review the previous year's BIA. We might just look at the list again, if you will. All right. Mm-hmm. But then in the following year, let's do a formal BIA using some of the output from the previous, but let's do it again. Because like you say, a lot of things have changed. New products have been introduced. You know, in the business world, things change constantly. And that can truly impact the business impact analysis and the solution should the stuff hit the fan. You don't want to find out at time of event that, oh, that's more important than this now, and we don't really have the resources to support that new entity because no one told us, or we didn't think it was that important, or whatever the excuse is. But you don't want to find out at time of event that that's the issue, that's an issue.
So this is probably not really an answerable question. But would you say that the sort of abandoning the script, i.e. the process in the planning phase, is more common or less common than abandoning the script when that happens at time of event, or somewhere after the event occurs, where people sort of go off and do their own thing and forget about the fact that they have a plan? Which do you think is more common? And then I'll have a follow-up question for you.
I think it's not the at time of event one, mm-hmm. because events, you know, again, a lot of people question why they haven't planned because nothing's ever happened to them. All right.
Okay.
But it's the other. It's they go through the entire process, they have a plan, and they think they're done. Mm-hmm. And so that's I would say, in fact, I can't tell you how many plans I've been involved with over the years, or how many organizations I've been at, but I'd be willing. I probably have on 5 fingers I can count the ones that stayed with the process, and I would bet money on their plan at mm-hmm. time of event, because they've ignored it, or they haven't given it the time they should have, or the time of day, let's put it that way. And so when the stuff does hit the fan, they're not prepared. Mm-hmm. So it is the folks that go through the effort to write the plan and spend the money and on the solution, and they never test it, or only test it periodically, or don't run the business units through the testing and exercising process. Mm-hmm. That's probably the most, I would say, the most common, by hands down,
is not doing adequate testing with the business. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, the aspect of sort of not following the plan at time of event. The thing that gets me about that, and I absolutely agree with what you said. I was sort of curious to sort of what information you would bring to your answer, but it's what I expected. But as far as what happens at time of event, you know, the amount of chaos that comes into a presumably chaotic situation, that's one of the things that aggravates me. We're talking about sort of this, people don't stick to the script, and this is one of the things that aggravates me is that yes, sometimes things happen that aren't in your plan and you do have to adjust on the fly. But when you actually have a plan that's been approved, that's been exercised, and then you abandon it at time of event, you're really just asking for a failed recovery from that incident. I mean, there are so many things that can go wrong when you deviate from that script, that plan. It's difficult enough to deal with a major event that has an impact to your business without kind of going off script. The communications piece that you mentioned earlier is a huge one. Why would any company let an unauthorized person say anything in today's modern world with the instant impact it can have on share price, brand perception? I mean, the whole 9 yards. And that's just sort of one very important piece of what happens when you go off script. But there are so many in that recovery process that can either cause you to not recover, delay your recover, lose your staff. You have a chaotic recovery and people are uncertain if they're going to get paid, or they don't know, like, well, do I report to work? Do I not report to work? Communication's terrible, all of that things. And then you have people abandoning ship when you have a solid economy. There's so many things that can go wrong. I really fail to understand why people don't follow the script in that regard. It's a huge frustration for me.
I have a theory on that one.
Okay.
And it's pretty simple. It's because, you know, we tell the business continuity coordinator that they're the person that's the traffic cop at time of event. But that person typically is so far down in the organization that no one's, well, they don't even know that person exists, or but it's the other side of that is having a senior sponsor that is directly involved with the C-suite, the executive level, that senior sponsor who that business continuity coordinator works for. Okay. That's the person that needs to communicate at time of event that we have a plan. And in the events that I've been through that were successful in sticking to the plan, it was that senior sponsor that pretty much told everybody else how it was going to work at time of event. And that's my theory on it's so far down in the organization. And if there is no level, and again, that's where the term I used it earlier, awareness comes in. If you write the plan and you go away and no one in the organization, particularly at its highest levels, knows that we have a plan. And that's, you know, in the FDIC, the rewrite a couple years back, it put a lot more emphasis on senior management involvement, senior management awareness of the plan, as well as the board of directors. And with, it used to be if you talk to them once a year, you were good to go. But what most of my most successful clients in terms of awareness at the senior level, they're touching that literally on a quarterly basis at every board meeting, that there is some kind of discussion about the status of the business continuity plan.
That's how it should be. Good.
And so that's the way it should be. And that's when the stuff hits the fan, those are the organizations that they may struggle, you know, because it doesn't always, you know, it's tough to plan for some things, right? But the ones that make it through it are the ones that have that highest level of awareness that we need to stick to the plan so we can get through this thing as best as possible.
John, thank you so much for today's conversation. I found it very interesting and enjoyable, and I think the audience will as well. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Find the Kingsbridge BCP podcast wherever you find your podcasts, and check in with us again. We publish one every 2 weeks. John, would love to have you back again as a guest in the future. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Okay, take care now.